Okay, A Violent Choice, 1861 to 1865. Basically, America's Civil War. Now, guys, you don't have to write a lot of this stuff down. This is just numbers I'm going to throw at you. You can see that the North has almost double the states and territories that the Confederacy does. It has 2 times the population, 5 times as many goods produced in manufacturing. For workers, there's 13 times more industrial workers. They have twice as many miles of rail. An army that's bigger than 2 times as great as the Confederacy. So this is going to be a pretty hard battle, a hard war. Now we start off with the politics of war. Union policies and objectives. Well, guys, remember, Congress wasn't in session when the Civil War broke out, forcing Abraham Lincoln to govern for 3 months by executive proclamation. Beyond calling for 75,000 volunteers, he had to suspend the right of habeas corpus, especially to put down wannabe secessionists in Maryland. He began to organize the federal military forces. What were some of the problems he faced? Well, they included an aged officer corps, old weapons, scarce supplies, and a small navy and army. And he really wanted to expand it and to use the U.S. Navy to blockade Confederate forts. Basically, his top general then was General Winfield Scott, who came out with the Anaconda Plan of basically splitting and surrounding the Confederacy by seizing the Mississippi River. That, it was hoped, would doom the South economically. Ready to go to the next slide? Now, just as he had said in his inaugural address, the Northern war aims were to restore the Union. Indeed, Abraham Lincoln said that there would be no interference with slavery where it existed in the South. Now, of course, he probably did that as an olive branch to try to get more states to reconsider joining the Confederacy. Because remember, there were northern states like Maryland, like Kentucky, that did have slaves that went with the North. He did face radical division within his party. For example, the radical Republicans wanted a severe punishment of the Confederates. Abolitionists, meanwhile, wanted to put an end to slavery Indeed, Garrison claimed that even though Lincoln was 6 feet high, he was a dwarf in mind. And basically, to pull everybody together, Lincoln used appointments, both militarily and politically, to win over all the factions. So that's the North. Let's take a look at the South. The Confederate policies and objectives. You want to talk about problems? Just look at the Confederacy. They had no army. They had no navy. They had no war supplies. They had no diplomatic ties abroad. They were plagued with internal political disagreements. And their industrial capacity was far below that of the North. So difficult problems, cause for creative solutions. So what did the Confederacy do? Well, the South mined their harbors and rivers. Then they purchased English military ships and some civilian ships. To act as revenue cutters that basically could try to break the blockade. And they also did get some that were like the the CSS, Confederate States ship, Alabama. That was like a frigate. But the South counted on its army for ultimate success. And here at the beginning of the war, you had thousands that rushed to volunteer. Meanwhile, Josiah Gorgas organized the industrial production and procurement of war supplies. And Confederate President Jefferson Davis, his strategy to win was basically fight a defensive war. He believed if you could drag the war out until the North found that it was too costly to keep throwing their men at the Southern lines, the North would give up. Because it's a lot easier to defend than attack. Now, diplomatically, the South sought international recognition, especially from Britain, because Britain had a very strong army and a very strong navy, and 80% of all the cotton that they used came from the South. But what the South didn't realize is that they had kind of bought a surplus of cotton from them, and were already starting to experiment with growing cotton in Egypt and India. So Britain only granted them a belligerent status, not recognition. A belligerent status says, hey, we realize you have problems with the northern states, but if they had been recognized as a separate nation, then they could have gotten military aid, loans, everything like that. And the North almost pushed Britain to recognize the South in what we call the Trent Affair. The Trent Affair occurred in November of 1861 when James Murray Mason, a Confederate emissary to London, and John Slidell, minister to France, were aboard the British ship Trent, which was a ship that was in neutral waters, and it was a neutral ship, but it was captured by the USS San Jacinto after leaving Havana. Goodness me. And of course, England freaks out about this, and the North does everything they can to appease Britain, to prevent a break between the North and Britain. Then we get to the Union's first attack at the Battle of Bull Run, which the Confederacy called the Battle of Manassas. And of course, the North thought that there would be a quick victory. They marched out there, and the South was out there, and basically the Union forces panicked and ran. Northern General Irwin McDowell had highly spirited troops, but they were poorly trained, and their slow march gave the Confederate States of America under General Beauregard time to position his troops to defend a vital rail center at Bull Run. And at the battle, the South was saved with the arrival of reinforcements under Thomas J. Jackson, who basically stood strong against the North, prompting one Confederate say, "Rally behind the Virginians. There stands Jackson like a stone wall." And so he got the nickname Stonewall Jackson. And then the North, when they were trying to escape, basically they got delayed by civilians who had come out with like picnics and everything like that, because they thought this was going to be a great victory for the North. So they were also clogging the roads of escape. And after this battle, when the North left the field, basically the South became sure of their ultimate victory. The North, however, realized that this was going to be a long war. And in response to this, Lincoln relieved Scott as his chief general and appointed George McClellan in his place. George McClellan was a guy who was known as the young Napoleon, who excelled at organizing his troops, but was kind of indecisive. And as McClellan was hesitant to attack, basically the war in the East ground to a halt. Ready to go to the next line? All right, from Bull Run to Antietam. The war in the West. Basically out in the West, you have, like in Missouri, both sides fought each other in guerrilla-style fashion for the duration of the war. In New Mexico, an invading Texas army went out there and was able to win, and they were victorious. But the Union, before they retreated, they burned all their supplies, basically practiced a scorched earth policy. So with no supply, the Texas Army was forced to return. Well, what were the war's implications for the Native Americans? Well, you had Indian uprisings that broke out when federal troops were taken out of the frontier forts and sent to fight in the South. Like the Santee Sioux killed more than 800 settlers in Minnesota. Meanwhile, the South established alliances with several Indian tribes, even though they didn't really prove helpful in the war effort. Like Texas Governor Edward Clark proudly boasted to President Davis that 20,000 Indians were allied with him. And Albert Pike signed treaties with many Native American tribes, like the Cherokee. For example, Stan Waite, Cherokee, became a Confederate general. Now, of course, also, you did have some Native Americans that allied themselves with the North. Ready to go to the next slide? The struggle for the Mississippi River. Well, y'all remember that according to the Anaconda Plan, the North really wanted to get a hold of the Mississippi River to split and kind of really harm the economics of the Confederacy. So the North sought to gain control of the upper and lower Mississippi, and Grant was able to bring much of Kentucky and most of Tennessee under his control. Ready to go to the next slide? The Battle of the Wilderness. Now, guys, you don't have to write down all these numbers. Sherman, Grant were the northern general. Johnson, Beauregard were the southern generals. The North had almost twice as many troops as we did. And even though the South I think we won. But if you look at the total number of casualties, they only suffered 13,000 dead. The South suffered 10,000 dead. 10,000 out of 44,000 is a heck. That's a fourth. Whereas 13,000 out of 75,000, you still have even more troops to spare. So basically, in a war of attrition, even though the South might have won the battle, they cannot continue to have losses like this. Ready to go to the next slide? Meanwhile, in fighting for the Mississippi River, Admiral Farragut is able to take the lower Mississippi when he captures New Orleans. That's where they came up with the famous line, "Damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead." But the torpedoes that he was talking about were basically mines, underwater mines. And the northern advance down the Mississippi River, kind of was ground to a halt at Vicksburg. Lee's aggressive defense of Virginia. Well, the South's main military goal was the defense of its capital at Richmond, Virginia. And because the North was facing defeats, Lincoln really needed military victories in the East. Ready to go to the next slide? This, of course, is where you have the outcome of the naval battle between the USS Monitor and the CSS Merrimack, of the two ironclads that fought each other. Well, the real name of the Merrimack was its northern name before it was converted into the CSS Virginia. The Monitor had a turret that could revolve, whereas the Virginia had to turn the whole boat. And the battle was pretty even during most of it, but then something happened to the steam engine aboard the CSS Virginia, so it retreated to port. And then people said, well, then the Monitor won it. And this fact is probably true because the CSS Virginia never reemerged from that port. Meanwhile, McClellan undertook the Peninsular Campaign in order to capture Richmond. But because of his indecisiveness and slow advance, Confederate forces under Lee were able to retreat to Richmond. And his right-hand man, Stonewall Jackson, was able to lead a diversionary campaign towards Washington, D.C. This fake to Washington, D.C. made McClellan start to retreat. And as he's retreating, kind of in confusion, Lee attacks him, which forced McClellan to abandon the Peninsular Campaign. Well, Lee knows that if, in order to get recognition, he thought that the Confederates should go up north and win some victories so they could prove to foreign countries that the Confederacy was a real deal. So he attacked Maryland. And unknown to Lee, one of his battle plans, its paper was used to wrap up a pack of 3 cigars that he kept in his vest pocket that fell out. A Union soldier found them, took them to his commander, because he thought, hey, the commander's really going to like these cigars. Commander opens up or cuts the rope that binds the paper to the cigars, looks at the plans and says, oh my gosh, these are the battle plans. And even though they had that, it was a very tough battle at Antietam. And after this battle, Lee began to withdraw from Maryland. And he retreated to Virginia, but McClellan's indecisiveness again prevented a possible destruction of Lee's army. Diplomacy and the politics of emancipation. Now, despite the Confederate efforts to woo Britain in, Britain maintained its neutrality. Not only were Northern ambassadors extremely effective, but like I told you, Britain had a cotton surplus. And the Confederate defeat at Antietam kind of confirmed Britain's policy of neutrality. And under pressure from radical Republicans, Lincoln drew up the Emancipation Proclamation. And after the victory at Antietam, even though all of his advisors said, don't say it now, they wanted him to hold off 6 months longer, but Lincoln goes ahead and he released it after the victory of Antietam, basically freeing any slave in occupied territories. So the Emancipation Proclamation in reality didn't free any slaves. You still had slaves up in Maryland. But the abolitionists nevertheless hailed it. Ready for the next slide? The human dimension of war. Instituting the draft. Well, both armies faced a serious lack of manpower by the end of 1862. The North, they enacted the Conscription Act. But if you were someone who had a lot of money, you could buy an exemption or hire someone to be a replacement for you. The South's compulsory draft also allowed for exemptions under the 20 Negro law. In other words, if you owned 20 or more slaves, you didn't have to go fight. Now, as you can guess, this caused deep resentment in both sections. Like in New York City, the Federal Army had to suppress violent riots against the draft. And how would they protest in the South? Well, in the South, they just simply wouldn't show up. They wouldn't report for duty. Ready for the next slide? Wartime economy in the North and South. Okay, wartime activity or economy in the North and South. Now in the North, governmental actions like railroad subsidies, higher tariffs, and the Homestead Act underwrote economic growth. Later on, unsafe financial practices, greenbacks and bond sales would set the stage for post-war problems. Meanwhile, the South's economy, well, they lack an industrial base. Because of this, the government offered loans trying to stimulate industrial production. It printed paper money that isn't backed by gold or any other kind of spice. And this lack of a major industrial base really hampered their war effort. War supplies were always insufficient, and there was widespread hunger. I mean, even in the army. And with the Union's blockade and capture of New Orleans, the loss of the Mississippi made the South's economy even weaker. Ready to go to the next slide? Women in the two nations at war. Well, in both sections, the women assumed greater responsibilities. They took charge of farms and businesses and worked outside the home. Now, of course, there also were women that participated as like nurses, scouts, couriers, and spies. And more than 400 women actually served as soldiers. Ready for the next slide? Well, free blacks, slaves in war. More than 200,000 served in the Union Armed Forces. At first, free blacks were rejected for service, but later on they were permitted to enlist. Commanders would often accept runaway slaves as laborers, also known as contrabands. And African American soldiers suffered various kinds of discrimination, like they received a lower pay, there weren't any black officers, they had to serve in segregated troops and facilities. Few were allowed to fight. However, they won respect when they did. For example, the 54th Colored Infantry, as seen in the movie Glory. The Confederates would commit atrocities on African Americans fighting for the North, rather than take blacks as prisoner. The South relied on slaves for food production, military labor, for the remaining cotton production, and other war-related industry. Ready to go to the next slide? Life and death on the front. Life in camp was often as dangerous as the battlefield. I mean, there were constant problems in supplying safe drinking water and disposing of waste. So it should come as little surprise that diseases like dysentery and typhoid fever frequently swept through unsanitary camps. Smallpox, pneumonia, and malarial fevers pass rapidly from persons to persons in the crowded conditions. Ready to go to the next slide? Well, to try and combat this, in June of 1861, Lincoln created the U.S. Sanitary Commission. Both Confederate and Union nurses showed bravery and devotion. Meanwhile, surgeons on both sides could usually do little more than amputate limbs to try to save lives. And as you can guess, these horrific conditions were even worse in prison camps like Andersonville, even though they were just as bad at the northern camp. You ready to go to the next slide? Waging total war. Lincoln's generals and Southern successes. The battle at Chancellorsville was a loss for both sides. The North lost the battle, but the South lost Stonewall Jackson, who was the right-hand man of General Lee. Two critical Union victories occurred in 1863. One was Grant's capture of Vicksburg, which gave him control of the entire Mississippi River. Meanwhile, Lee's army was defeated at Gettysburg, turning back another northern invasion. But Meade, who was the general at Gettysburg, proved to be more indecisive when he didn't pursue Lee's retreating army. So Lincoln removes him and puts in Ulysses S. Grant. Ready for the next slide? Grant, Sherman, and the invention of total war. Basically, what I just told you, Land appointed Grant General-in-Chief, and Grant was willing to wage total war or to tolerate enormous loss of life in order to win and to move decisively. He knew that the North had more men and that the South could be ground down. Sherman also favored total war and waged it. And Grant assumed command of the army in Virginia. And driving towards Richmond, The Union Army sustained terrible losses at Wilderness, Spotsylvania, Cold Harbor, but they kept pushing forward. So Lee occupied Petersburg, blocking the way to Richmond, beginning a 10-month siege by the Union Army. Ready to go to the next slide? The election of 1864 and Sherman's march to the sea. As an election is approaching, the Republican Party was divided. Radical Republicans, they nominated Fremont for president because they wanted a more vindictive treatment of the South. The Moderate Party, or the Union Party, nominated Lincoln. The Democrats, they nominate George McClellan, that guy who had been the leader of the Union armies earlier in the war. And their platform called for an immediate peace with the South. Just let them go, let them see. And guys, it was pretty close until Lincoln got some pretty decisive victories, which we'll talk about in the next slide. Basically, Sherman undertook his march to the sea, and after devastating the South from Atlanta to Savannah, he turned north into South Carolina. Meanwhile, Confederate forces formed up in North Carolina under Johnston to block Sherman's further advance towards Virginia. Oh, wait a minute. No, I left some stuff out. Sheridan drove the South's army out of the Shenandoah Valley. And the radical Republicans rallied behind Lincoln. And remember, I told you about Sherman and his devastating march to the sea, where he basically burned down Atlanta, Savannah, moved up to South Carolina. Ready to go to the next slide? Meanwhile, Lee abandoned Petersburg. He hoped to travel down to North Carolina to join up with Johnston. But before he can get there, Grant has his army that meets him at Appomattox, where Lee was forced to surrender. Actually, he wasn't forced. He chose to surrender. And a few days after this, Lincoln is assassinated. And even though Lincoln, despite Lee's surrender, some fighting did still continue. And guys, that's it. So remember, we have our next deal is going to be the final. All right.